Mobile weapons on the field of battle. The battle between the Ally of Justice and the worm invaders from outer space raged on. The arrival of the Ally of Justice's mechanical masterpiece, Ally of Justice Catastor, seemed to be a turning point in the battle. But as more of the smarter and larger worms entered the fray, Catastor alone could no longer withstand the onslaught. It needed to be stronger, it needed to be faster, it needed to be sharper. Something that once deployed on the battlefield would wipe out the worms and would still be ready for the next fight. The development of such a weapon was fast-tracked. Engineers worked themselves to the bone to meet the new, more demanding specs. For it to perform as well as needed, they were forced to make it bigger and more complex. The weapon was bestowed with lots of new features, but this also made the development of a sophisticated control unit for such a sophisticated machine all the more difficult. The engineers racked their brains. At this rate, we'll lose. The planet will be overrun with worms. Then, one engineer had an idea. Why don't we ask a Gen X to cooperate with us as a central control core? They control the forces of nature, like fire and water, and have highly advanced tuning abilities. So shouldn't they be able to operate a big mobile weapon? After some consideration, the proposal was approved. A Gen X spare that had been adopted by the Ally of Justice was then embedded into the mobile weapon. The moment they saw such an enormous weapon move during its first launch test after incorporating the Gen X spare, everyone involved gasped. How could such a small-looking mechanical being move such a huge weapon all by itself? And with that, the huge, dominating, Ally of Justice Field Marshal was complete for the time being. After several startup tests, the Ally of Justice Field Marshal was ready to enter the battle. There, it was paired up with a Gen X controller, employed as a communications device to translate and transmit orders. The actions of the Field Marshal were incredible. Despite wave after wave of worms, it mowed them all down. It was like all of the struggles before had been nothing but a bad dream, as the balance of power shifted in an instant. The victories kept on coming. As the new weapon delivered victory after victory, the morale of the troops rose, and to them, the weapon became a symbol of hope. Yet even though the weapon seemed invincible, damage was unavoidable in the midst of combat. Destroyed armor and burnt barrels can be swapped out before dispatch to the next battle. But the core that controlled the massive machine, the Gen X spare, could not be switched out so easily. While the weapon's exterior may have looked pristine, battle after battle had quietly left the Gen X spare profoundly and definitively worn out. On that day too, the Field Marshal stood on the battlefield. At a very strategically important point in one of the many hotly contested areas. The resistance put up by the worms that day was more fierce than ever before. Together with the Field Marshal, the allied forces of the tribes and clans fulfilled their duties and struggled on. But a small gap in the formation opened up, and worms swarmed into the breach. At this rate, the worms would likely reach the encampment and the Gen X controller. Did the Gen X do what it did because it knew its first priority was to eliminate the worm blight? Or was it to protect the sole entity it could talk to on the battlefield, the Gen X controller? The field marshal immediately left the front lines and rushed to where the encirclement was broken. Then, using its own massive body as a barrier, it blocked the worm's incursion, risking itself as it attacked with reckless abandon. The battle ended, and the horde of worms was forced back. While the Ally of Justice had prepared for defeat at the base, it seemed to have been narrowly avoided. Nevertheless, the losses were great. The wreck of the field marshal's frame was still emitting heat even after the battle, the heat shimmers distorting the surroundings. The field marshal could no longer move when a small figure approached. When the Gen X controller reached the interior of the frame, it found the Gen X spare lying there. There was probably less than a minute left until it was due to deactivate. Making the most of the precious time it had left, the Gen X spare offered the Gen X controller a single white flower. Once the Gen X controller accepted it, the Gen X spare fell completely silent. Was this leaking coolant? A glistening liquid was pouring out of the Gen X controller's eyes.